Good afternoon again. This is Laura Rittner from the Success Center for Ohio Community Colleges, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our second webinar in our series. This one is on supporting Ohio's community college students during COVID-19, and we are so thrilled to welcome national expert and friend Sara Goldrick-Rab, who is joining us today. I know many of you site and other resources. She founded the Hope Center for College Community and Justice in Philadelphia and serves as professor of higher education and sociology at Temple University. I think, Sara, your work has been incredibly important for the field, for all of us in Ohio, absolutely for our students, and it was important before COVID-19, and I think it's even more important now. So I want to thank you for taking time. I know you've been busy doing lots of meetings and virtual convenings like this, and when I sent an invitation to you, you accepted almost immediately, and I know that you have many friends in Ohio and you've been to our campuses, and so we thank you for joining us this way this afternoon, and we're ready to have a great discussion with you about supporting our students.
Great.
So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all so much, and thanks for the invitation. I did jump at the invitation. This is the fastest trip to Ohio I've ever taken. So, yeah, no, I'm excited to have this conversation. I've tried to put together a couple of slides that I hope would be useful to kind of get things moving. I think those of you who know me know that I love the Q&A, and really always happy to have discussion. I'm going to put out some ideas. They may not strike you as right. That's totally fine. You know, I really want to have that conversation. I'm going to just work on sharing my screen. So just give me a half second here. And looks like that worked. And I just need to start my slideshow. You know, I just want to first make sure that we anchor ourselves in kind of, you know, what we're going to talk about today. And I know that, you know, as Laura said, these are issues that my team's been talking about for a long time. Some of your colleges have been experiencing for a long time, but I don't think there's ever been a moment like this one in terms of the depth of the challenge. And one way that I talk about this is, you know, thinking about what happens when you are in a conversation with a student and you ask them what seems like a very simple question: how's college going? That's something that my team does all the time with college students. And we've learned throughout our research that the answer that comes back might not be what we expect. And in fact, that's what set off this whole stream of work that we're now doing on food and housing insecurity, was simply asking that question of an 18-year-old undergraduate in the fall of 2008, which is getting a lot more attention right now because, of course, that was the onset of the Great Recession. And the answer that came back from that student was, not good, I haven't eaten in 2 days. Clearly, this is not what anybody who is trying to help students, trying to help them graduate wants to hear. But it's also an answer that I think that we're going to have to get increasingly used to hearing and have a ready response. So in terms of responding, I think many of you, including many of your colleges, have participated in some data collection that we have been doing for the last 5 years. We've come to call these surveys, which have become an annual habit for us, real college surveys. And, you know, in case you're, I'm sorry, my light just went out. I'm just going to ask my tech support here to turn my light back on. That means my husband, by the way. So, you know, in terms of why we name these real college, you know, I think everybody has their favorite survey, whether it's the community college survey of student engagement, and there's a financial wellness survey. What this survey is all about, thank you so much, tech support. What this survey is all about is really trying to talk about the stuff that's very real for students and that's often kind of swept under the rug, so to speak. And I don't mean colleges are doing that intentionally. I just mean it's stuff that people don't always talk about in polite company. So these surveys, when we first started them, were something that I think, to be really honest, most colleges were really uncomfortable with. Didn't want to field these to their students, very concerned that, you know, knowing, for example, how many students were dealing with food insecurity was, first of all, uncomfortable perhaps because that's not something you have money to address, and also perhaps uncomfortable because it might contribute to stigma, for example, about who community college students are. But over time, I think a lot of people have overcome that. And so now we have a really robust body of evidence, data from over 330,000 students at over 400 colleges and universities, including many in your state. But I also want to acknowledge that those 5 years of surveys, which started in 2015 and have gone through 2019, they all predate this pandemic. And we do have a survey in the field right now. It's at about 50 colleges around the country. And we are actively collecting information from students, and we'll be reporting out in June on what we're seeing in terms of the latest in terms of the prevalence of food and housing insecurity. But here is what the numbers have looked like from those prior years. These are summaries across time. And we do give you ranges because we can't be too sure about our estimates at any one given point in time. They depend on the particular sample of colleges that participated. And of course, they always depend on the sample of students who respond. But as you can see here, pre-pandemic, we are reasonably certain that as many as 1 in 2 community college students were affected by food and/or housing insecurity. And the definitions we're using for these things, they come from validated measures. The food insecurity measure is the United States Department of Agriculture assessment. It is not a simple question like, are you food insecure? To be perfectly honest, most students, if asked that question, they wouldn't know what you were referring to. They do know things like, you know, in the last 30 days, have you found yourself short on money from food and afraid that you were going to run out? Or in the last 30 days, have you had to cut the size of your meals or skip meals because you don't have enough money for food? They do know the answers to those questions. So that's what we ask. Housing insecurity. This is a complicated set of issues that often can lead someone to be at risk of homelessness. So right now, for example, housing insecurity looks like people who can't make their rent. It looks like people who are delaying paying their utility bills or are really behind on those bills. It looks like people who are doubling or even tripling up in a house because they can't pay their bills, which is certainly bringing new challenges with regard to social distancing. We're telling people, you know, to be isolated, and yet many of them are living in overcrowded conditions because that's the only way that they can afford to keep a roof over their heads. In terms of homelessness, the numbers you see here reflect the use of our definition, which comes from the Department of Education. We use the same definition that is employed for high school students. And it's because, frankly, when it comes to housing, there's really not a lot of difference that happens between when a person is 18 and when a person is 19 and transitions to college, or even when a person is 30 years old. They still need a safe, stable, regular place to live. And most of that homelessness is not things that you would see on the street. So it's not visible kinds of items like, you know, have you been sleeping outside or have you been sleeping in a tent? It's much more common that the issue is that students are couch surfing, which can be week to week. It can also be night to night. I think it's also important here, you know, to recognize that while the community colleges are the place that these issues are most commonly discussed these days, four-year institutions have these challenges as well. We know a lot less about the extent of these challenges at two other types of institutions that I want to single out because I think it's worth discussing. We don't know much about what these issues look like at the most selective colleges and universities, those who turn away the vast majority of applicants. They don't tend to do these surveys. And secondly, we don't know what these issues look like at the for-profit colleges and universities where they have not agreed to participate in surveys thus far. Now, there are widespread disparities in who experiences these issues. Our reports, all available on our website, will take you into any racial ethnic category, for example, that you'd like to look at. As you can see here, most of the same disparities in college completion obviously exist with regard to food insecurity as well. The same is true around homelessness, but this is meant to help you see that a number of the populations that many of us are working very hard to support, we have special programs, for example, that these folks are at particular risk. Tomorrow, we're releasing a brand new national report about parenting students. Students who have children, we have used a much broader definition of who constitutes a parenting student than many typically use, certainly broader than what the FAFSA picks up. And our report discusses the extensive nature of basic needs and security for this group, and also how it relates to their needs for childcare and other supports. There's a demonstrable relationship between childcare unaffordability and students' basic needs and security, for example. A couple of other issues to highlight. One of the things that has struck us and has been true across all of our surveys across time is that LGBTQ students are particularly at risk of these challenges. And I want to underline this for you as we get to talk later in this time together about the CARES Act. You know, one of the big reasons that these students are at so much risk is because when they go to do the FAFSA, they are told that they have to fill in their parents' information. And they are at much greater risk of being estranged from those parents, to not be in touch with them, primarily because the parents don't accept them for who they are. And as a result of that, the student may look like they have resources from their parents that they do not have access to. So as a result, many of these students here are not in fact Pell eligible. If you target your resources according to Pell eligibility, you will not reach these folks. So these are actually a sizable fraction of the students who cannot do FAFSA at all. If you are interested in doing the survey, I just want to flag for you that we opened the sign-up period very recently, and it goes through the middle part of July. We are offering the survey this fall. We don't have philanthropic support so that we can provide it for free anymore, but it is a very inexpensive survey, and it is very effective for fundraising and advocacy. So if you would like to do it this fall, you can go to our website. Also, if price really is a concern and you really can't do it without support, please do indicate that you need a scholarship, as we are in active conversations with philanthropists to try to help some colleges be able to do it this fall, recognizing, of course, that COVID really creates some need to have the latest data, even if you've done the survey in the past. Okay, so one of the most useful things that the surveys give us, and that I want to use to talk with you about approaches to helping students, is the surveys. They ask students about the services that they're using. And I think most of us know, for example, that we have campus food pantries, and we can, for example, find out how many students have used them. You can have an unduplicated head count and get a sense of how many students are approaching the pantries. But the really salient question is, what percent of the students who experience these challenges, who really need help, are actually connecting to those supports that you're offering them? And one goal that you might take as an institution is not so much to say you will no longer have any homeless students, which frankly may not be realistic, especially given the circumstances of job loss and other things, but rather to set as a goal that you aim to connect students who are struggling with services that are already available. So in other words, to increase your utilization rate. And as you can see here, there's a lot of room for improvement in those utilization rates. So students experiencing any kind of basic needs and security, which is what B&I is, it's food and or housing insecurity and or homelessness, using any government assistance, 54% at the community colleges, 40% at the four-year schools. This is an area where we actually are not surprised the community colleges are outperforming the four-year institutions, because the community colleges have taken, frankly, more seriously and centrally the importance of connecting students to public benefits programs. And to the credit of folks like the Center for Law and Social Policy, they have been providing technical assistance to help schools do that. But when we turn and look at the percent of students who are dealing with these challenges and are using any kind of campus support, we see the opposite. It appears that utilization is lower for the community colleges than for the four-year institutions. And in both cases, it's quite far from what you'd hope to see. You'd hope to see that students facing these challenges are in fact connected to support. And I think a reasonable goal would be to ensure that at least 50% of them are connected to something, if not higher. The CARES Act and emergency aid is getting a lot of attention right now, and many of us for years have stressed that emergency aid is perhaps the single most effective tool that we can deploy in the money category because it is flexible. And yet we see that only 2% of students experiencing any of these challenges have connected with and received some sort of emergency aid. Now, of course, one issue, and no doubt you're thinking of it, is simply a lack of funding to support those emergency aid programs. And that is a major concern, and it shows up in surveys. But another concern that we do see, and it's reflected in both institutional data and student data, is that there simply isn't widespread information about the existing emergency aid programs and how to access them. Finally, down at the bottom, you can see that there's a lot of room for improvement with regard to connecting food insecure students to SNAP and around connecting food insecure students to the food pantry. So, it is rather disappointing given the substantial growth in food pantries over time, the fact that many of them have gone from being a shelf inside a closet to being a whole closet or even a whole room, that so few students are actually connecting to them. And part of this may be that they don't offer enough food, but it's also likely that there is stigma around using them and that stigma has not been effectively counteracted yet. So let's take one of those and dig in a little deeper. As I said before, emergency aid can be extremely impactful. That evidence, by the way, it doesn't just come from higher education. It also comes from efforts around the world to alleviate poverty and to help people send their children to school, to help them get job training, to help them become a more successful employee. Cash transfers are very, very successful. And I think this is one of the most useful lessons that we can take in higher education. Cash transfers are more successful when they have fewer restrictions on them. In fact, there's a word for this. There are conditional cash transfers with a fair number of eligibility criteria and restrictions. And then there are unconditional cash transfers. There's essentially money for the person to use as they see fit. The latter category, unconditional cash transfers, is way more successful than conditional cash transfers. But of course, our financial aid system, to the extent that we do cash transfers, is almost always conditional cash transfers. To make matters worse, while this legislative season and in the last couple of months, it did seem like we were going to finally have something closer to an unconditional cash transfer program. With the CARES Act, Congress and the Department of Education compromised the extent to which these things could be impactful. The first problem, of course, is the amount of money and the way it was allocated to institutions. And I'm sure you all are very familiar and frustrated with the extent to which it was distributed based on FTE rather than headcount. That is an area the Hope Center shares your concerns with, and we are actively working on additional materials to educate policymakers, some of whom seem to think that part-time students have fewer living expenses than full-time students, and others of whom seem to think it actually costs you less to educate a part-time student rather than a full-time student, when in fact the opposite is true. Second issue is that even though the law does not require it, the Department of Education has declared that students must be Title IV eligible in order to receive the CARES dollars. And further, that information has not been, was not shared promptly at the start of this process and has been rolled out in a bit of a haphazard way over time, which has created a lot of confusion. The main problem with that is not only the confusion, but the lag. So part of the way you get impact from emergency aid is to move as quickly as possible to remedy the situation, and it's been hard to do that. And I just want to acknowledge that that is not your institution's fault. We are doing everything that we can to try to help students understand that too. We've been trying to message clearly to students that pressuring the institution to put the money out faster is probably not going to actually lead to a more successful outcome for those students. So you're understandably stressed and time constrained, and it seems likely that under those conditions, you may be leaning towards a couple of approaches. One approach that we've been hearing from a lot of institutions is the essentially saying, well, in an effort to get this out, let's not use an application. Let's use our existing data. Let's look at the FAFSAs that we already have on file, and let's target using Pell. And I want to flag for you a couple of considerations, right? The first is that those data are now really outdated. So clearly they reflect often data on employment from 2 years ago, and things have changed radically. Very few students have actually filed and updated their FAFSAs. Second, there is tremendous amount of need that is not captured by Pell eligibility. I reflected some of that before, but clearly, it is a needs analysis that has flaws, and we've known that for a long time. The other thing, and this is perhaps a little more controversial, there are some who are thinking that it might be best to target the students with the most need, the 0 EFCs, and give them the most support. But in many cases, to the extent that you've already distributed support, and to the extent that the government is providing support, those are the individuals who are already receiving a disproportionate amount of the support. So for example, the students who are already on the Pell Grant often were the first to receive emergency aid from institutions and/or philanthropy. And also those students often were already connected to public benefits programs, which in some cases actually appear to have buffered them from this latest pandemic. In comparison to the students who have never even heard of getting on SNAP, or who might not have been chosen for the earlier support, who might in fact be the ones struggling even more right now to pay their bills. So that's not to say it's a terrible idea to try to use existing administrative data to move quickly, but it is to say that it might not achieve the amount of equity and impact that you're really striving for. Now, another consideration that we've been hearing a lot about and that I want to reflect on for a moment is the concern that when you're sizing up who can and should receive CARES dollars, the language used may lead you to think that it's not appropriate for addressing all basic needs. So the specific language is to cover expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to coronavirus. And I've received many notes, especially from community colleges, saying that that's really unfair because it advantages institutions where students disproportionately live on campus. Well, that's true. And in fact, that is what policymakers mostly had in mind, because they were hearing stories of students who were being kicked out of residence halls. But of course, there's a couple of things that are problematic about this. The first is that the students who live on campus are disproportionately advantaged compared to students who live off campus. And second, only 15% of the nation's entire body of undergraduates actually lives on a campus. That said, there are many other ways in which students' housing situation, for example, could be related to the disruption of campus operations. So here are a few examples for you. A student who is struggling to pay their rent or to afford food would often, under normal circumstances, seek support when they're on campus, for example, from someone there in order to access other benefits or identify alternatives. Not only have campuses moved to online courses, but you've also experienced disruptions that leave your staff to be extra busy. I think it's fair to make the case that therefore, as a result, your students had compromised access to people to give them that help, who may then, in turn, have led them to not have the support that they needed. In addition, these students who struggle with things like rent and utilities and food and transportation and all of those things, they typically turn to emergency aid funds. And your funds were also rapidly depleted because of the disruption in campus operations. Therefore, it's possible that their ability to secure those basic needs were also disrupted and would be eligible for CARES dollars. A couple of other thoughts about ways to think about both the distribution of the CARES dollars and the distribution of your other emergency aid dollars. As I said earlier, speed is key with regard to maximizing impact, especially of emergency aid. But that refers to the speed at which you process an application and dispense your support to a student who has just applied for emergency aid. That does not mean that the best way to get equitable impact is to go and disperse all of your dollars immediately as soon as you have them in May and June. In fact, it might not be the best idea, because essentially you will be supporting students who did get to the end of the academic year. And you have a bunch of students coming in the fall and even in the summer who are also at risk, and maybe at even greater risk than the students who are dealing with it right now. So it's important, I think, to think about allocating those funds and perhaps segmenting it into pools of funds to be distributed at different moments throughout this coming time period. You have a year to distribute and document and report on the CARES dollars to the Department of Education. Secondly, to the extent that you decide to give out the funds and tell students that when the funding runs out, you can no longer help them, please remember that first come, first serve is actually not equitable. It's often thought to be the fairest thing to do. You know, the people who get there first have the most need. It's actually the case, though, unfortunately, that the people with the most need are often the last to apply for support. And there's a really good reason for that. People facing scarcity are enduring many challenges, including cognitive impacts of that scarcity, that will lead them to have the most struggles connecting with information that you're trying to provide them, and will also lead them to struggle the most to complete any kind of application or comply with any sort of requirement. So it's precisely because of their need that they will not often be the first in line. So it's something to consider. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure many of you are considering this, is that given that such a sizable number of students were left out of the CARES Act, it's worth considering ways to braid your funding streams to serve those folks who are not eligible. And the most important part of that is that you do the braiding on the back end. So rather than asking students based on your characteristics, like FAFSA filers go to this application and get your funds this way, non-FAFSA filers go over here, rather than separating them, we strongly recommend a single universal approach to outreach, directing them all to the same place and through the same queue, while on the back end, applying the funding streams depending on what the student's characteristics are. I was recently sharing out an example of this from UC Berkeley. Their advertising clarifies that they have dollars available to a large number of different types of students. They are inclusive of international students, for example, and graduate students. So they specifically name those populations so that those individuals know they can also apply. They clearly message on their advertising that the funding is limited and that it will not be able to serve everyone. But they have them all go to the same website and take them through the same process. And on the back end, they apply the CARES dollars when they can, they apply state dollars when they can, and they apply their own institutional and private philanthropic dollars when they can. Two other things I want to emphasize. The first is to please do everything you can to avoid making the situation worse for students by asking them to do what we call perform their poverty in order to get help. Asking students to write a long form answer or an essay about the incidence of poverty that they're facing might seem like a good way to figure out their need. Unfortunately, it's not. It actually cues students to try to find ways to express their situation in the most dramatic terms so that you will give them support. Other students who are facing really big challenges don't know how to tell you that story in the way that you want to hear it, and they will fail to be able to qualify for support. Finally, asking students to do this is a form of re-traumatizing them. And it is in many ways, because it is so racially sensitive as well, it is also considered a microaggression. These things matter. You don't have to, I mean, whether or not we agree that they matter for social justice reasons, I think we should agree that we want these dollars to be as impactful as possible. So therefore, as a student goes through the process of getting them, we want to try to avoid causing any negative impacts by sort of sideswiping them with requirements that don't actually give us what we're looking for. And the last thing is, and I said this before about Berkeley, do your best to ensure that your application is online. That does not mean putting telling students to go email an address to get an application. It means putting the actual application online and making it easily discoverable. When a student Googles your institution's name and the term emergency aid or help, your emergency aid program should come up. And I've been doing this at random with institutions around the country, and I can tell you it's still really hard to find these things. Please do everything you can to advertise as widely as possible what support you have. Everyone understands that support is limited, even the students. What they really appreciate is your effort to do what you can to support them, even if you cannot help everyone. Now, I want to give you a little glimpse of a program that I work with that could just help illustrate one way that you could approach the delivery of emergency aid to students. This is not the only way, and I want to fully acknowledge that I'm going to show you an example from a private company. I further want to emphasize, for those of you who don't know me, that in addition to my role as a researcher and director of the Hope Center, I also work with a nonprofit that distributes emergency aid, and I'm Chief Strategy Officer at this company called Equity. The main reason that I work there is that we have taken my research and my ideas and we have operationalized them in an actual support program that can help students. What I want to illustrate for you is how these principles, though, can play out in the midst of a disaster. And unfortunately, that disaster did happen recently for the Dallas Community College District. So we formed a partnership with them, and we had agreed to roll out last fall to support them in October. And together with the chancellor, we had set a launch date for our support of October 24th. Lo and behold, without any knowledge this would happen, that was the date we set. On October 21st, 10 tornadoes struck Dallas, causing $2 billion in damage. Many of the people affected were Dallas Community College students, and also many of the people affected were the staff and the faculty who have to serve those students and support those students. So you can imagine, much like the current pandemic, when lots of people are affected, how challenging it can be to try to turn around on a dime and get these students support. But fortunately, the district was able to respond fast because the staff didn't have to do anything. Instead, the students were able to download our app and fill out an application on the app or on a website, depending on how they wanted to access it, and receive their decision about that and the funding directly that way. No one in the foundation had to do a thing. No one in the financial aid office had to do a thing. No one in student affairs, okay? We were able to respond within 117 seconds for them to finish their application very quickly. It took up to 62 minutes for approval, and in under 48 hours, they received their support. They could receive it in two forms. The first form is if they had a bank account, we could make a deposit directly into their bank account. Now you might be thinking, low-income students often don't have bank accounts. I thought so too. And in fact, most of these students told us they didn't have bank accounts. But when we asked them again and specifically said, do you have a bank account? Because we will deposit $500 in that bank account. Suddenly, over 80% of them, in fact, had bank accounts. And they logged into those accounts and we were able to deposit the money. Now, really critically, this wasn't something we did for just a few people. This scale was so important, and that's really what brings up, I think, the current pandemic, which is this is not about getting 10 applications a day. This is about processing 571 applications in a single week. And I know there are colleges out there right now that are doing that volume. Also critically, while we all operate on a regular business schedule, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday for the most part, most of these applications arrive after business hours. Students applying between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. Do not have to wait then to get help because this support is available to them 24/7. The sorts of students that can be reached when you put your services online and you don't ask them to interact with a staff member, they are disproportionately those with greater need. And this is something that has been found, again, in research around the country, especially men of color and especially people who are in the deepest trouble and are the most marginalized are much less likely to complete an essay to do their application or interact with a person for an interview. So they just don't apply. As you can see here, when we change that and make it easier for them to apply in the privacy of their own space, we reach a number of important and very vulnerable populations. Okay, so I hope that that gives you some illustration of how this can work. I also want to urge you to do whatever you can to go beyond financial aid and supplement it, because clearly the dollars will never be enough. The most important thing that you can supplement it with right now is telling students repeatedly how they can file for unemployment. Many of them don't know. They should know, but they don't know. And a lot of the information that's out there leads them to believe that somehow being a college student means that they're not eligible. But many of them are eligible, and it's critical. Many of them are also becoming eligible for SNAP, and there is a bunch of pending federal legislation that would make it even easier for some of them to get access to SNAP. If any of those bills pass, it will become incredibly important for you to get that information out to students. And even if you don't have staff to actually do eligibility assessments with them, at least giving them the nudge to apply for SNAP is important. The same thing is true with regard to Medicaid. Many students don't realize that they can go on and update their income information if their income has fallen, and their premiums and their payments may very well be lowered. Finally, I should note, there are a large number of students who have delayed filing their taxes because we were given an extension. The downside of that is that they might actually benefit from filing their taxes sooner so that they can receive refundable or partially refundable tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. Again, not suggesting that colleges become social service agencies here, just suggesting that given that the Pell isn't going to get it done, and given that your emergency aid will undoubtedly run out, helping these students to connect with these other programs can help them make up for income losses, and also critically, therefore, help them stay in school. The last thing that I want to underline, and then I'm happy to take questions, is the importance of your government relations teams doing some real significant advocacy. Students obviously are getting some support from Congress right now, but probably not anywhere near what we need. And the same thing goes for your institutions, for that matter. You know, I think it's important that we do whatever we can to ensure that going forward, institutions are distributed resources based on headcount. And we also need to be very clear and careful about distribution based on where student need exists. One of the things that you could advocate for is the temporary suspension of work requirements in public benefits programs, or argue that post-secondary education should count towards those work requirements if they're going to remain in place. This is really important since there are a large number of people who are subject to work requirements and cannot meet them right now to get help because they've lost their jobs. There will be additional stimulus bills. I think most of us, recognize that there are many in progress, so don't give up hope there in terms of actively pursuing additional supports. And of course, remember, the governors have some discretion over their dollars as well, although of course there's always this fight over those dollars with other constituencies. Our website has a tremendous amount of information on it right now. We pivoted as soon as the pandemic hit to begin to create specially targeted resources around COVID. So if you look at our website, you'll find an entire page filled with those resources. We're releasing between 2 to 3 new resources every week. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be able to get those sent directly to your inbox. And of course, we're also sharing everything on social media. We'd always be happy to have one-on-one conversations, and we are always available for technical assistance. One of the most remarkable things that's happened during the pandemic is that we have received some additional support from private philanthropy so that we can help colleges more regularly and with more staff. In fact, just last Friday, we finally hired for the first time a director of policy. Which is really wonderful and is allowing us to do more evidence-driven advocacy on behalf of these students around the country. So I'm going to stop there and happily take your questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I would encourage people to go ahead and post questions in the Q&A box. A couple have come in, and if you could just share a little bit more about the resources that are available on your website. One participant asked if there's some of the data that you shared earlier in the presentation. And then there was another request if there's something that kind of summarizes what you shared today in a brief or some sort of material that could be shared with colleagues who aren't with us here.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. First, if you are on our website and you're looking for research, basically these numbers that I've been sharing, and there's a section called research, and you will find reports that summarize the survey results. The most important one is clearly labeled the 5 years of real college survey data. And so that's the most important one probably that you'll be looking for. There are also a number of reports on specific subgroups of students, depending on your interest. And there are some that are targeted by specific geographic regions as well. In addition, on our COVID page, you can find briefs that summarize my recommendations around the CARES dollars. There are also a set of policy briefs that summarize those very specific recommendations. You can see the advice we offered the Department of Ed, as well as the advice that we've been offering Congress. And in addition, there are guides that you can download and distribute directly to your students. So there is a guide that many colleges have been pushing out to their students because it talks about a variety of resources that are available to any student. It's not unique, it doesn't need to be unique to Ohio, for example. And then there is also a corresponding infographic there that you could also share out. So I urge you to explore all of those. The other thing is we have also been doing a series of webinars, and there are recordings of all of those webinars on that same COVID page, all in one place for you.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing all of that and for doing all of that work for the field and for our students. There was a question about, I think, the CARES Act and whether the funds can be spent on students or future students who are not currently enrolled. And I don't know if you feel like you have the up-to-date answer on that question, or if we want to refer that one to the Department of Education.
Well, it's funny, I've been on prior webinars where I'm like, okay, look, this is the latest thinking on this topic, and then she goes and changes it the next week, so who knows. But let me just say this, that is kind of why I'm suggesting that you hold some of the funds, right? So some of these students are not students today in July. As we all know, some of them won't even register until August or September. But if you have some funds left for them in September, yes, then they are your students. Now, can you use those dollars to pay their tuition to help them register? My understanding from the latest FAQ is no, that is not allowed. There are some schools, I think, that are trying to do that and are getting some negative press. It will probably be stopped. But if you wait until they do become a student, I believe that you can do that. So, that's the sort of upside downside of waiting a little while.
Okay, thanks for that. And we did a webinar last week for the presidents of the colleges with someone from Casey Sachs from the Department of Education. So we're trying to share information as quickly as we have it.
That's great.
It is an evolving situation.
Yeah, Casey's doing her best. So
she's a great advocate for community colleges for sure.
Yep.
So the next question is, since students have technical disparities, how are you personalizing services to students to ensure they are connected to the services they need?
Yeah, most of what we have found, and we have a couple of studies in the field where we're trying different techniques to help connect students to services. We haven't found the need to be actually overly personalized. Students mostly just need to see that their name appears in the email or the correspondence that you're sending to them. And they need to actually get through the email. And unfortunately, when we tend to review correspondence that colleges send to students, it tends to include far too much information. So when we have tested ways to boost outreach, to improve utilization rates, we have one of these studies, for example, with Amarillo College right now. What we focus on are short and sweet, very specific messages that say, dear specific student, right? We are encouraging students to take advantage of this resource because it will help you in your college journey. So framing it as framing a basic needs support as still part of being a student, right? Not saying because of your poverty or anything like that, right? Centering it on their mission, on their goal. And then lastly, just telling them the who, what, when, where, when, and why of getting the support. Preferably not in paragraph form, because they, like you, are skimming. And then closing with a reiterating of your desire to have them get that support. Beyond that, the other trick is to send that message repeatedly. So I do understand that some students say we get too much email from our college, but I would worry a lot less about that right now. I would say that it is far worse for them not to get the important information that you're disseminating to them because you only sent it once or maybe twice. I would really say it is important to come back to them over and over if you possibly can. And depending on your mail program, you may very well just be able to send it to people who do not appear to have opened the message. But the reiterating of things is essential when you're trying to communicate with people who are deeply stressed.
Thank you for addressing that. We had another question come in by email from our lead for the holistic student support coaching that we offer to the colleges. She wasn't able to join us today, but Krista asks about students who fall through the cracks because of stigma and shame, and they won't ask for help, emergency aid, or visit the food pantry. How do you think we can help them get the aid that they need, the students who need it the most? And I know you addressed a lot of that, so I might ask you to, share any additional insights, but also speak to, do we think that maybe with the COVID-19 crisis, we may see, with the volume of students needing help and the publicity and promotion around aid, that we do get it to some who might not have asked for it?
I think you are. I think you will. I think that's happening, frankly. That may be one of the tiny silver linings here, is that this may give some students and some colleges a little bit of permission to start to talk about these things more regularly and to feel like it's part of what you discuss, because this clearly is not your fault that this has happened. Nonetheless, though, what really changes these things for students is when the leadership talk about issues like food and housing insecurity out loud. What students don't want to do is something considered deviant, right? Something that they think that is not part of being a student. Many students will say, people told me about how to get my books for class, and they told me that I should study, but nobody said out loud that it mattered that I ate. Remember, in high school and in elementary school, they do talk about that. They actually talk to them about the National School Lunch Program. Everybody knows there's a form, or it's all given to everybody else. It's a universal program, depending on where you are. These issues get talked about out loud. We have to do that. There's no substitute. If your institution has not yet sent a note to your students suggesting that you care about their basic needs, that you know that they're humans first, that you know that there's a real possibility that they'd have to disconnect from their education because they can't pay their rent. If you haven't seized the opportunity to do that yet, I urge you to do it, because it's not just going to show them who you are, it's also going to help retain them. They will be so pleasantly surprised. And that's one of those messages you should send more than once, because you want to make sure they really hear you. So that's the first and most important thing. And then the other thing is that has to trickle down. So the people who are on the front lines with students, some of them are really well aware and very conscious of how they speak to students about these issues, and others are really not. So, we unfortunately continue to hear about students who will say to a professor, I'm sorry I didn't get the assignment in, something went wrong with my place and I couldn't have a place to sleep last night. And we still have faculty who say things like, that's not my problem. Or that's not, I'm sorry, but the test goes on. And the only way that's going to change, again, is first and foremost through leadership, and secondly, through peer-to-peer conversations. And so to the extent that this is an opportunity for a faculty association or a faculty union or a group of staff to just begin to talk with each other more about these things, to raise awareness that there are good and not so good ways to speak to students about these issues, that will also help.
That's really helpful. So I have a question, and then there's a question that we'll close with about how to access the recording after the webinar. There's a lot of speculation, and we're already seeing for summer some trends around enrollment, either going up or going down across community colleges. And so if you had a crystal ball, I'm going to ask you, what you think in the next year this is going to mean for community colleges in terms of the ongoing response to the crisis and coming out of it. And then, maybe moving forward, what you think it's going to mean for higher education, some of the lasting impacts. It's a tough one.
It is, although I actually have a writing assignment from The Atlantic about exactly this question. So I've been thinking about it. It's interesting. I think back to 2008, and I think back to the fact that we started to finally pay more attention to community colleges during that time. Now, part of the reason was because we had someone in the White House who was very interested in those institutions, and we had a number of well-placed champions in a number of different places. And it's not like all of the great things that were proposed came to pass. So, one of the things that I loved was the American Graduation Initiative, which was proposing $12 billion in institutional support for community colleges. But as more middle-class people started to have to consider community college because they couldn't afford a four-year institution, and they had a good experience there, we did make some progress, I think, as in terms of getting some attention to the sector. That still has not, however, helped the perpetual and just persistent underfunding of these institutions. And so my biggest concern is I don't know that community colleges are going to see enrollment declines this fall. I think they're going to see increases, quite possibly. That's long been true. It's countercyclical. Mm-hmm. But I am concerned that completion rates are certainly not going to improve under the circumstance. And I am concerned that, as always, this is a sector that's going to be asked to do more with less. I cannot help myself but to say it really depends on who's in charge next year. Because under certain leadership, I think it's possible to seize this moment and to make it clear that the future of our economy depends on strengthening our community colleges, and to, at minimum, revitalize some of those older proposals around the American Graduation Initiative or something else to try to propel both free tuition to students, along with significant institutional investments and changes to things like the SNAP program, the National School Lunch Program, and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit to try to improve their housing and food situations as well. But, it's going to depend in part on what y'all do in Ohio. and it'll depend also, by the way, on what leadership at the state level does as well. I mean, so much of the variation among states right now is caused by what people are asking their governors to do. You all have not had a Hunger-Free Campus Act, for example, to get your institutions more support, and that's something that you could work on. Mm-hmm. There's a number of possibilities.
Well, I know we have our OACC VP has been on the webinar, our lead for advocacy, and I'm sure that he'll want to reach out to your new policy director. So we're excited.
No problem. And I'm happy to, if other folks have questions, I see that we didn't get to all of them. I will try to type a couple of those in, but I'm also happy to connect with anybody directly if they want to do that as well.
Okay, excellent. So we'll follow up. One was a clarification about when you referred to returning citizens. The community has answered that that's individuals coming from incarceration.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So that one has been answered. Good. And the other one is a specific one about whether students need to report philanthropic gifts to financial aid.
That's a fun one. Sort of depends on who you ask. The answer is sort of technically anything that could be conceived of as financial aid should be reported to financial aid. And I am very aware that in Ohio, it seems that the interpretation is always yes. But I do want you to know Ohio is the only state in the nation that I go to that seems to uniformly interpret the answer as yes. So plenty of emergency aid and philanthropic gifts for students around basic needs regularly is not reported to financial aid in other states. So that had led me to wonder actually recently whether it was an Ohio rule, and it does not appear to be. It just appears to be, as we're in communities of practice, and it seems for some reason the community of practice here has taken a particular interpretation. So maybe
Well,
something for
that is
discussion.
interesting, something for us to explore
Yeah.
further. And
Yeah.
also interesting because there are a few things that all 23 of our colleges do in the same way.
Yep. Yep. And it might not be all 23. It might just be selection bias that I have come into contact, but it comes up all the time. And I think we should all ask ourselves about that. You know, I mean, it's a tricky thing, but I don't think we can pretend like we ever know all the forms of support that every student receives. It's very hard to track. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a closing slide. I'm going to switch over. I do want to tell you, if you haven't seen them, there are lots of thank yous coming through in the chat. And, you know, I, of course, want to echo those and thank you again for your time. We will post the webinar on our website, the recording, as well as a summary of the notes and the resources. And I don't know if you plan to do that as well, Sarah, on your website, but I know that people will be able to find it on ours.
Sure.
The link is here. We will share it in a follow-up email. We also do a survey after each webinar. It's quick and easy. It asks you for feedback and also for suggestions on what additional topics we should cover. We have our next one coming up next Thursday. We've invited Robin DeRosa back again to go deeper into her use of open educational resources and why she's a champion for OER. And we are confirming with Davis Jenkins and Hannah Lahr from CCRC. They're going to be doing one in late May or early June. We are also going to be having Allison Cadlick from SOVA lead one on how to effectively manage teams in the virtual setting. And we have a few others in the works. So we're open to your suggestions. We plan to keep these running through May and June at a minimum. And we really appreciate everybody signing on this afternoon. I know there are lots of things that are competing for your time and attention, but I hope this was helpful. I know it was for our Success Center and OACC team. And Sarah, thank you again for your time today and all that you're doing for our students. You're a great advocate.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Stay in touch. I know we will.